And we are on the record for the hearings in the matter listed in the North Dakota Industrial Commission hearing docket for March 1st, 2022. I'm Stephen Nelson, hearing examiner for these hearings, and we are in the hearing room for the Department of Mineral Resources, Oil and Gas Division, and it is 9:02 a.m. There are two cases on the docket today, beginning with case number 29224 in the matter of the petition of Burlington Resources, Oil and Gas Company, LP, for an order of the Commission providing for the unitization, management, operation, and further development of the Haystack Butte Bakken Pool Unit located in McKenzie County, North Dakota, for approval of the unit agreement and the unit operating agreement constituting the plan of unitization for the Haystack Butte Bakken Pool Unit, for approval of the plan of operation, for vacation of the applicable spacing order, and for such other and further relief as the Commission deems appropriate. Would all interested parties please come forward?
Thank you, Mr. Examiner. Wade Mann, P.O. Box 2798, Bismarck, North Dakota, appearing in this case on behalf of Burlington Resources Company LP. And I'll have three witnesses testifying at the hearing today, and they're all present at the table. Mr. Brian Dart, Shira Johansson, and Melody Zhang.
I guess we will begin with your first witness. Please, we're starting with Brian Dart. Sorry. Yes, make all the appearances here.
Rob Forward on behalf of Liberty Petroleum.
Microphone, please.
Liberty Petroleum Corporation. Got it. I'll start over.
I'm sorry. Thank you.
Rob Forward to Bismarck, North Dakota, representing Liberty Petroleum Corporation of New York.
Lawrence Bender, P.O. Box 1855, Bismarck, appearing on behalf of Continental Resources, Inc. and XTO Holdings, LLC. If this matter is approved, Continental Resources will have a 40.48% interest, and XTO will have a 3.58% interest.
And will you be having any witnesses?
Oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Examiner. I may have a witness depending on how things go, although as a result of my conversation with Mr. Mann, I think my role will be limited and we probably will not call a witness.
Okay.
Same for me. Thank you.
All right. Then I believe we will begin with your first witness, Mr.
Yeah, Brian Dart.
Brian Dart. Please raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear or affirm under the penalties of perjury that the testimony you're about to give in this matter will be true and correct to the best of your knowledge and belief?
I do.
Brian, can I have you state your name and give us your business address?
My name is Brian Dart. Our business address is 935 North Eldridge Parkway, Houston, Texas, 77009 or 77079.
And who do you work for, Brian?
ConocoPhillips.
Okay, and what's your position with ConocoPhillips?
Staff land negotiator.
Okay. And are you familiar with the land matters associated with this proposed unit?
Yes, I am.
And were you involved with preparation of the petition for unitization along with the unit agreement and operating agreement?
Yes, I was.
I would move the testimony of Mr. Dart be received as that of an expert in this case.
It will be received as expert testimony.
Brian, can you go ahead and identify the proposed unitized area for us?
Right, so if you look at Exhibit L1, this is the Exhibit A to both the unit agreement and unit operating agreement. It depicts the outline of the proposed unit boundary, which is 15,356 acres, approximately. If you look at the map, you'll notice that the lands that are owned by the federal government are depicted in white. The lands that are owned by the state are in the crosshatch, and then the lands that are gray are fee lands. So there are 24 sections in total within the unit, and there were 12 existing spacing units that were 1,280 acres and one 2,560 acre unit. All of this is within McKenzie County, and all of it is within the Haystack Butte field.
Okay. Can you describe for us a little bit the purpose of this proposed unit?
Yeah, so this unit is going to allow Burlington to have flexibility in its development. This is an area that features rough and challenging topography. And unitization will allow us to drill the maximum number of wells with the smallest surface footprint. It will allow us to locate facilities and pipelines in an optimal manner, and it will allow Burlington to access additional hydrocarbons by drilling longer laterals through the elimination of setbacks and DSU lines.
And I believe you indicated you were responsible for preparation of the unit agreement and operating agreement. Can you just describe a little bit for us how you came up with those agreements?
Sure. The unit agreement is based off of the required form by the federal government. The amount of interest the federal government owns in this unit is over 10%, so we're required to use their form, so that it is the federal government's UA. The UOA is based upon our Corral Creek Bakken unit form that we did about 10 years ago. And we've also incorporated some other provisions that that were included in other approved units from XTO's Grinnell and Hoffman units and Continental Resources Long Creek unit.
Okay. And Mr. Examiner, the unit agreement and the unit operating agreement, L2, those were the pre-filed exhibits. I did hand out to Ms. Cattermas a hard copy here. It's marked as L2, but for purposes of saving paper, I didn't reproduce the whole thing for everybody again. So that's what consists of L2. And Brian, then does the plan of utilization, does that address the designation and authority of a unit operator?
It does. Let me find where I am here. Yeah, so Article 6 sets out that Burlington Resources will be the designated operator, and then Article 3 sets out some of the broad authority that the operator has under the unit.
Okay. And does the plan have formulas for the allocation of production among the separately owned tracts?
It does. In Article 12 of the unit agreement, this outlines the allocation formula, and that'll be talked about more by Melody in her testimony coming up.
Sure. And does the plan account for the manner in which expenses for the unit and further development of operation will be apportioned?
Yeah, it does. Article 11 of the UOA addresses unit expenses, including the basis of charges to the owners, how to deal with unpaid expenses, existing non-consent interest, among other things.
Okay. And does the plan have a procedure to establish which wells, equipment, and other properties of the several lessees within the unit are to be taken over and used for unit operations?
It does. In the unit operating agreement, Article 10, this addresses the equipment and the wells that are going to be taken over and used as unit wells. There are 19 wells that are on site right now within the boundary of the unit, and those will all be proposed as adopted as unit wells.
Okay. And does the plan of unitization address an effective date for the unit?
The unit agreement in Article 20 addresses the effective date would be the first day of the month after approval by the BLM or the federal government. And obviously, if the commission approves this unit, we'd have to have some coordination between both agencies on how to work out the timing with that.
Sure. And does the plan also address dissolution and winding up of the unit?
Yeah, it does in the unit agreement. So Article 21 covers the term of the unit with the time period. And then within Article 22 of the UA, this covers termination of the unit by the work interest parties.
Okay. And Brian, has Burlington Resources had any communications with other working interest owners within the proposed unit?
We've had communication with a number of owners and have actually had discussions with both XTO and with Continental Resources, and we'll be adopting some changes to the forms accordingly.
So as a result of those communications with both Continental Resources and XTO, you've agreed to make some revisions to the unit operating agreement?
That's correct.
Okay. Why don't let's go ahead and walk through those. We've prepared some exhibits that incorporate most of the revisions. Let's go through, starting with L3. Can you take us through the revisions to 3.2.8 of the operating agreement?
Yeah, so in L3, this depicts changes to Article 3.2.8B, where this is revising the language from a requirement of 80% of the parties to a simple majority for approval for an audit, and then lowering the hurdle from 3 parties approving to 2, and then clarifying that the voting interest of the unit operator would be excluded from that calculation.
Okay. And Brian, that revision was at the request of Continental Resources, is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And then yesterday afternoon, Brian, a letter was submitted to the commission on behalf of, I believe, Continental and XTO, and there was additional revision to 3.2.8 that XTO requested. Have you seen that letter?
I have.
And you've seen the proposed revision, which would add a subpart C to 3.2.8?
Yes, I have.
Okay. And is Burlington Resources comfortable with making that revision and adopting that subpart C to 3.2.8?
We are, as drafted, yes.
Okay. But we just don't have that on Exhibit L3 because we weren't aware of it till yesterday afternoon, the specific language, is that correct?
That's correct.
And would you have any objection to incorporating the letter filed by counsel for XTO into the record?
No objection.
Okay. Let's move on then to Exhibit L4. Is there also a proposed revision to the force majeure clause?
Yes, so if you look at Article 15.4, this change requires the unit operator to provide notice and details of any force majeure event and provide that to the parties, to the workers' owners.
Okay. And that was a request on behalf of Continental?
That's correct.
And Burlington will agree to incorporate that into the revised unit operating agreement?
Yes, we will.
Were there also some proposed revisions to the accounting procedure?
There were.
Let's go ahead. I believe there were 3 of those, is that correct?
That's correct.
Let's walk through those one by one, beginning with L5.
Okay, L5, starting in provision or Article 5 there, services. So we're simply adding the highlighted language there, which says is an integral part of the predetermined compensation pertaining to services to provide joint operation. So we're adding that language in.
Okay. And then L6?
Yeah, L6, other expenditures, Article 15. That last sentence was previously struck in our proposed corpus. We're adding that language back in.
Okay. And then one more revision to the accounting procedure in L7.
So in A, at the top of the page there, we have revised those percentages from 6 to 5 in Part 1, from 4 to 3 in Part 2, and from 3 to 2 in Part 3 of A. And then struck all of B, and then struck the sentence after the next paragraph.
Okay. So, Brian, I guess what Burlington Resources would I guess, propose or agree to do is incorporate all of these revisions in these supplemental land exhibits, plus the, which are consistent with the letter, plus the subpart C to 3.2.8 in Mr. Bender's letter into a revised unit operating agreement and resubmit that.
Yes, yes, we will.
Okay. And I guess, Brian, are you also aware of a letter file or that was sent in by Liberty Resources?
Yes, we are.
Okay. And I believe that letter raised a concern with respect to section 11.8 of the operating agreement. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And I guess before we get into the specifics of sort of that provision and their request, where did you get section 11.8? Where did you get that language?
Yeah, so this is language that we saw featured in other approved other NDIC approved units. such as XTO's Hoffland and Grinnell units and Continental's Long Creek unit.
So this language, which it comes from other unit operating agreements that have been approved by this commission
That's correct.
and are currently in effect.
That's correct.
Okay. Have you read the Liberty letter?
I have.
Okay. And what's Burlington Resources' position with respect to changing the existing section 11.8?
We're in disagreement with changing provision 11.8. We think that as drafted is sufficient to manage the party's non-consent interests for a number of reasons.
Did you want to touch
Sure,
on any of
yeah,
those?
absolutely. With the unit, we think, as the letter that was proposed by Liberty requires the unit operator to have an undue burden to change the way it accounts for production for its wells, for those wells that may have a non-consent interest, to potentially change the way it has to set up its facilities, metering, measuring, and a lot of the benefits of a unit basically go away with having to do well accounting and not have just simply a single set of books and production for the unit. So we think it's an undue burden. We think that as drafted, the provision sufficiently addresses the issue of non-consents. We think that the past precedent of the commission approving that language as proposed is also a good precedent for us. There's multiple ways a party could have approached dealing with the non-consents. We think this is a median approach. We could have, on one extreme, had one payout account and used all the unit production revenue to satisfy that payout balance. We're not doing that here. We could have, on the other extreme, done what Liberty's proposing, which is quite extreme, which is do individual well accounting. This approach allows the operator to still maintain accounting under a unit basis with not individual well accounting, and simply for the affected tracts where there's a non-consent interest, have those tracts have a carried status. And so all of the revenue from the unit production would go to satisfy that payout balance for those affected tracts, and we think this is the most appropriate way to deal with it. And finally, the unit agreement or unit operating agreement also addresses if a party wishes to not be in a payout status or not wishes to have their interest burdened by a payout status, would be they can simply do an early payout. So Article 11.13 addresses if a party wishes to pay off the balance early, they are able to do so.
Okay. So I guess, in your opinion, Brian, is the existing language that has previously been adopted on at least one or two other occasions by this commission, that's sufficient to address the incoming non-consent interests?
That's correct.
And that's in the best interest, in your opinion, of all of the working interest owners as opposed to a single owner who wants it changed?
Yep, it is.
Brian, does Burlington Resources have experience in developing and operating similar primary recovery units within the state?
We do. We were involved about 10 years ago in the formation of the Corral Creek Bakken unit. So this was in Dunn County to the east of the proposed unit here. It was an area that features very similar terrain, very similar topography, similar challenges with respect to siting wells and developing, and it was a huge success for us. So I believe we premised 81 wells at the hearing at that time, and we've drilled more than double that. So we have experience with doing this. A lot of the drivers for this unit come from our experience and our success within the Corral Creek Bakken unit, and we'd like to take that and adopt it here.
Okay. And Brian, can you give us an update on the status of ratification of the proposed unit?
Sure. So on the royalty interest side, for phase one, we have 3.9%, and for phase two, we'd have 4.4%. We are still in discussions with the BLM, and so once we receive the ratification, we'll be over the 55% threshold. And we're in coordination with discussing that with them now.
Okay.
And on the working interest side, with the addition of Continental Resources ratification, and with ours, we're above 80%.
Okay. Mr. Examiner, that's all the questions I have at this point for Mr. Dart, and I would offer the land exhibits at this time.
Exhibits are admitted. So I believe we will start with Cross, and I believe we'll start with Mr. Forward and then Mr. Bender, and then go to NDIC staff for their questions.
Thank
So,
you.
Mr. Forward?
Thank you, Mr. Examiner. Mr. Dart, my name is Rob Forward, and I'm here on behalf of Liberty Petroleum Corporation. I believe we were talking earlier, you were talking earlier with Mr. Mann about a letter that was sent in. And I think there was some mix-up in the name. It's actually Liberty Petroleum Corporation, correct?
That's correct.
And you've got a copy of the letter in front of you there now?
I do.
And in that letter, it indicates that Liberty participates in 7 of the wells that we're talking about here today, correct?
That's correct.
And they've elected to go non-consent in 4 of those wells?
That's correct.
And that was in under a prior arrangement with Burlington, correct?
Mm-hmm.
I'm sorry, you'll have to say yes or no.
Yes, that's correct.
And you've had conversations with Mr. Greg Clerfeld of Liberty?
Yes, had a phone call.
And he's expressed his concerns about what Section 11.8 will do regarding the working interests and costs of the non-consent elections of Liberty?
Well, he wanted clarification on how he intended to administer 11.8, yes.
Okay. As I understand it, you indicated that there were a number of reasons why this would be an undue burden on Burlington to continue on with the previous arrangement you had with Liberty, correct?
That's correct.
And one of those undue burdens was that you'd have to change the way you set up your books.
That's correct.
What were the other 2?
Facility design and measurement.
Does that constitute one more, or are those 2 more?
It's probably one and the same.
Okay. Any others?
I'm sure there's others, but none that come to mind.
And then we spoke about the commission's ratification of other plans that have a similar Section 11.8, correct?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question?
Then you and Mr. Mann also indicated that you based your Section 11.8 on other plans that have been ratified by the commission, correct?
Yes.
Were you a working interest owner in any of those other plans?
Yes, in the Hoffman or Grinnell unit, one of the 2.
I have no questions. Thank you.
Mr. Bender?
Thank you, Mr. Examiner. Considering the testimony that was provided by Mr. Dart that they have no objection to including in the unit operating agreement the language that is set forth in my letter dated February 28, 2022, I don't have any questions for Mr. Dart. I would also point out that I haven't had an opportunity to talk to my clients about this objection to Section 11.8. And what I'll do between now and when Burlington concludes their testimony, I'll try to find out from my client what position they take, and then I'll just put that on the record.
Okay. And do you need any redirect, Mr. Mann? Or
No, Mr. Examiner, thank you.
any questions from commission staff?
I gotta go, so. Brian, I've got a couple questions for you. First of all, for the record, can you establish the relationship between the entity that all the exhibits belong to, ConocoPhillips, and the applicant in the case, Burlington Resources Oil and Gas LP? I think we know it, but for the record, please.
Yes, Burlington Resources is a wholly owned subsidiary of ConocoPhillips.
Okay. And then secondly, on your exhibit L1, you've got a little call-out box at the bottom there with a dashed line around it. Is that being excluded from the unit, or what? What's the point and purpose of
You mean
that?
that part there?
Correct.
Sorry, due to the river, there are very small unit tracks there, and so the call out is simply to try to show with greater detail those unit tracks and that information there. So,
So it's to make the riverbed tracks visible?
yes,
Okay, thanks.
yes, thank you.
Brian, L1 or your Exhibit A, are you able to provide that as a digital PDF copy?
Yes,
Okay. Would you also happen to have that in something like a shapefile type format that can be brought into a GIS or software?
likely yes. This was created by one of our brokers, and so I'll have to check with them. It could be AutoCAD, but I'll double check.
Okay.
And I'll-
Whatever formats are available, if you could provide them. We do want a PDF for the
Okay.
file itself, for the case file. But I guess through the course of the whole hearing, I'm going to be asking for multiple supplements in digital formats that can be brought into other software. So whatever format you can come up with other than a PDF would be appreciated on that.
Will do.
Are you aware of any depth severed leasehold in the unit?
I'm not aware of that.
Okay. And unit agreement, article or section 16, on page 12, I think. This is drainage.
Okay.
In reading through that, it looks like this, I guess the question would be, does this section prohibit unit line or section line wells on the boundaries of the unit?
I don't believe it does prohibit that.
Okay. Is there language specifically in the unit agreement somewhere that would allow for section lines or unit line wells?
I don't believe so, but I don't think that's necessary.
Okay.
There's a history, we have a unit line well that we've just now drilled, just offsetting the Crow Creek Bakken unit with the Pullman unit line well. So I don't think there's any prohibition that exists in the UA as drafted, and I don't think there's any requirement for additional language to address that. It'd
Okay.
just be basically a unit sharing well or a unit comm well, as it were, in the BLM's viewpoint.
And agreements would be made prior to drilling those wells? Okay.
Yeah, do a communitization agreement
Okay.
that addresses it.
I'll probably be revisiting the unit agreement a bunch of times with the rest of the witnesses, but for now, that's it.
Brian, typically the agreements will have border agreements. Does this one?
I'm sorry?
Border agreements?
Oh, border agreements. I think that's Article 34
Of the unit agreement?
of the unit agreement, yes.
So under the border agreements, wouldn't that be where you would address any lease line wells that would be along the unit boundary?
I suppose it could. I just know that with respect to how we've treated previous unit line wells, in terms of the pooling side with respect to the BLM, it simply required just a communitization agreement where the portion that's inside the unit would be shown with the existing CA number for that federal unit, and the other tracks that make up that spacing unit, as it were, would reflect the ownership, whether it be federal, fee, or state, as is. And so there's no additional agreements, at least with respect to the Bureau of Land Management, that are required. Obviously, and if we're forced pooling under NDIC statute and spacing accordingly, we believe we have all those issues addressed.
Okay. You talked about needing coordination between the administrative officer of the BLM and the NDIC. How do you propose that to happen so we have coordination on the effective date of the unit?
So the way I would understand it, we will re-engage with the Bureau of Land Management to get their initial approval, and that will basically signify that they've ratified, they're in agreement with this. Should the commission adopt our application and provide an order, the effective date, let's say it happened early in the month, we would obviously work with the BLM to say, hey, we have NDIC approval for our application. We would like the unit to become effective the first day of the next month. And I think that's how we would approach that.
The BLM typically will send us a follow-up letter indicating they've ratified the unit and the effective date, correct?
That's my understanding.
And do you anticipate that that would happen after the commission signs their order ratifying the unit? Or would that happen in the interim after we've signed the order for the unit, but prior to concluding that the correct ratifications have been received?
I guess that depends on how soon the NDIC would make a determination with an order. We don't have any reason to believe that the that the BLM needs much more additional time for their review. We've reviewed this with them for a while now, and so we would hope that we'd have that fairly quickly. But it's hard to speculate.
When do you anticipate that the unit will become effective? What's your date that you're hoping for?
We were hoping within the next 2 to 4 months. I think Corral Creek Bakken unit was 4 months from the hearing date. We'd hope for something sooner than that.
You indicated you've had conversations with Liberty on their request, and also that you would need separate facilities to account for production from their wells in which they've went non-consent. Have you had any conversations with Liberty on how you would account for production on those wells?
Didn't get into that level of detail. Our conversation with Liberty was late last week, so a lot of this was striking us very fresh, and dealing with how would we administer this, a lot of that was really fleshed out just in the coming days of if this was a requirement that we'd have to undergo. So no, we did not bring up with Liberty on the phone a lot of the nuances of the facility design issues.
It's Burlington's intent to account for production from every well monthly, correct?
Mm-hmm.
So you would have a mechanism to estimate oil, although you haven't, of course, went through and explained this to Liberty to see if they would be in agreement. But if you were to agree on a type of allocation to those wells, would you still be opposed to their proposal on amendments if all it came down to was just an accounting?
Could you ask the question again? I'm not sure I totally follow that.
Well, you indicated the reasons why you didn't believe that you should accept their proposed amendment.
Mm-hmm.
And one of them was the facilities. There was going to be additional costs that you would have to do to find the correct measurement of those wells. If you came to an agreement on that Liberty would accept how you intend to account for those wells in a commingling fashion, so that was no longer an issue, and the only issue you really had before you was just the accounting of it, how you're going to build them out, would you then be acceptable to their proposal?
I don't think so, because I still think there's an undue burden for us on the accounting side as well. our
Yeah.
preference is to have a single source of unit revenue, a single source of unit cost, and not have to treat wells, special wells within the unit differently. I think that's an undue burden on the operator, and I think this issue has already been addressed by previous forums and has been adopted by the NDIC.
Okay, and you can answer questions on the unit agreement and unit operating agreement, correct?
Yep. Yes.
The first thing I want to ask you about is the notice of hearing. This notice of hearing was sent out to all participants, I shouldn't say participants, but all those affected by the unit operations as a requirement of the commission. In that notice of hearing, it states there that the Haystack Butte unit is located in Dunn County, not McKenzie. Do you feel that that is an issue? And maybe Wade, you want to chime in on, so the notice itself states McKenzie County.
I don't
Pardon
think,
me, Ben.
I think that Scrivener's error is not really of issue. These owners were personally served, so it's not, with publication, and it correctly identifies both the township, the range, the applicable sections. All of that is correct. I think there's no issue with service. So I think it's simply a Scrivener's error, and it's of no impact.
And Wade, what you're saying is the application itself, the proposed plan of unitization, gives much detail in each tract and where it's located, and they
Correct.
were given personal notice, and you're trying to ratify them.
Correct.
I'm looking at the unit agreement. On page 3, it's Article 4. Talks about the unitized land and unitized substances. The first sentence says, all lands, including unleased federal land, that are committed to the agreement. When I went through Exhibit B, it doesn't appear that there are any unleased federal lands.
That's
Are
correct.
you aware of that?
Yes.
So why would they include that in the agreement? I mean, to me, it's unnecessary and kind of confusing when they leave that in there.
Point's well taken. We're simply adopting the federal form and leaving modifications to a minimum.
Okay. And then in section 5, the next page, talks about tracts qualified for participation. In the second sentence there, it says, on or after the effective date hereof, the tracts within the unit area which, in the absence of an involuntary pooling order issued by the commission, shall be entitled, and it goes on. To me, it's kind of hard to understand that, but it says, in the absence of involuntary pooling. So to me, it means that they didn't have the spacing unit pooled by the commission. Okay? Is that what that means?
It could mean that, or it could mean just for the entire unit being involuntarily pooled, such as this hearing now, which is basically going to be effectively a compulsory pooling order for the entire area.
But it does say tracts within the unit area.
Yeah.
And all tracts, all spacing units in the unit, all the 1280s, I guess I didn't check the 2560, but all the 1280s have been forced pooled by the commission.
Yes.
So to me,
Sure.
again, it is just unnecessary and confusing
Yeah.
to leave it in there. But I wanted to address it in case somebody down the road wanted to know why that's in there.
As mentioned in the previous answer, it's simply we're we're trying to limit our changes to simply those things that are unique to this application and this contract, and not trying to deviate too much from the federal preferred form.
On page 8 of the unit agreement, it talks about the operator concurrently with the filing of this unit agreement for final approval shall submit to the AO, the administrative officer of the BLM, for approval of the plan of operation. One of the things that the North Dakota statute requires is actually further development and operation of the unit. And it's extremely, it doesn't, I don't think addresses it necessarily as much as we really want it to. And what it's saying is that the administrative officer will later approve that. It doesn't say anything about the industrial commission. So I do think that we need to have an additional description of the plan of operation to fulfill the requirement that we have in our statute. And if the administrative officer is approving this, we certainly want it to be incorporated into what the commission is approving. So we would want that submitted. The next paragraph, this is the second paragraph in Article 11, talks about the right to inject any substances. Do you plan to inject any fluids into this unit?
Not at this time.
Is it possible that you would want to do that in the future?
It's possible. This application is for primary recovery, so in the event if we wanted to do that in the future, we would likely come back to the commission for discussion on that.
There's been several pilots out there where, I'll call it a huff and puff is what a lot of operators talk about, injecting in a well and then producing that well back with not the intention necessarily to move fluids throughout spacing unit or unit in this case. Would Burlington want to conduct such a pilot like that without coming back and having another hearing?
I'm not sure. I would probably defer that to either Shira or Melody's testimony, but I wouldn't be able to answer that.
I think we need to address that because although the commission may not be opposed to a huff and puff within the unit itself, if you start moving hydrocarbons across tracks, intentionally trying to do EOR with a substance such as CO2 or some other fluids, then it may warrant coming back in and doing a new formula to, protect the correlative rights of those parties that you're moving fluids around. So we would want you to supplement with that on what you're proposing.
Understood.
The bottom of page 8 talks about, under Article 12, talks about the participation and allocation of production. The well current rate talks about the well production during the preceding 90 online days prior to July 1st of 2021. Online, I assume you mean that it actually produced.
Yes.
Okay.
Correct.
There was one well, and I don't have it immediately in front of me, but one well actually produced 2 days during one of those time periods with no oil. And I'll address that later, but I wanted to mention it because that's one of the problems that we have with trying to come up with, making sure that you have the appropriate calculations. So hopefully when we get to the engineer or other exhibit, they'll talk about that. But is that what you mean in this agreement, that is actual producing days and you go back to 90?
Yes, it's actually producing days.
And then I'll ask later about the EUR, how the remaining primary was calculated. But the other thing is on phase 2, and this is the top of page 9, the remaining recovery of oil in place means 23% of the original oil in place. And when I go and try to justify that in your exhibits, it appears that Burlington used 23.7%, not 23%. But this did intend to have 23, is that right?
That's my understanding, yes.
And then later in that same article, it talks about the middle of page 9, the figure set forth opposite each tract in Exhibit C represents a tract participation in which such tract is entitled if all tracts are committed. Well, I'm kind of confused by that language. It sounds like a federal exploratory unit to me. If this is a statutory unit that the commission is approving, aren't all tracts in the unit committed to it?
They will be, yes. And
Again, it's
the
very
it's the challenge
confusing,
of-
and that,
Yeah.
I think somebody could question that down the road, so I just wanted to make sure we talked about it. Okay, we talked on page 14 of the unit agreement, Article 20. We talked about the effective date, and you're going to coordinate that. The term under Article 21 doesn't state there anything about the royalty owners on what they could do to terminate the unit. And we do have a regulation that says under 380809.4, it provides that the termination by royalty owners, and there's a process for them to attempt that. And even though it's not in your unit agreement, it is incorporated in what we're going to be approving, and I just want to point that out, that just because it's not in the unit agreement doesn't mean that the royalty owners don't have a manner in which they could terminate, according to the statute. And under 35, Article 35 unit agreement, on page 18, it's talking about the correction of errors. And it states there that if any corrections are made, the unit operator shall file copies with the administrative officer of the BLM. And the commission would also want to be
Yes.
notified of those.
Yep.
That's all the questions I have for you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Any further questions from commission staff? If not, we will move on to your next witness. Was it Mr. Joe Hansen? Please raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear or affirm under the penalties of perjury that the testimony you're about to give in this matter will be true and correct to the best of your knowledge and belief?
I do.
Shira, can I have you state your name and give us your business address?
Yep. I'm Shira Johansson, and my business address is 935 North Eldridge Parkway, Houston, Texas, 77079.
And Shira, I guess just for the record, can you spell your name so we have that accurate?
Sure. It's spelled Kyrre, and then last name Johansen.
And Shira, by whom are you employed?
ConocoPhillips.
Okay, and what's your position with ConocoPhillips?
I'm a senior geologist.
And have you previously testified before the commission?
Yes.
And have you had your qualifications received as that of an expert?
Yes.
And are you familiar with the geology underlying this proposed unit?
I am, yes.
And were you involved in preparation of the exhibits that supported the petition for unitization?
I was, yes.
Okay. I'd move the testimony of Mr. Johansson be received as that of an expert.
The testimony will be received as that of an expert.
Sure, why don't we go ahead and go through your geology exhibits, beginning with G1, if you can just identify that exhibit for us.
Sure. So Exhibit G1 is showing some of the petrophysical control points that were used to make the petrophysical maps that you'll see later on in the other exhibits. In terms of what you see on here, the blue wells are Middle Bakken wells. The orange are Upper Three Forks. Upper Three Forks being the same as Three Forks Bench 1, just our internal Conoco terminology. And those red dots are the wells with the petrophysical logs that were used for our petrophysical model.
Okay. Let's move on to Exhibit G2. Take us through that structure map.
Yes, so Exhibit G2 is a structure map on the Upper Bakken Shale across the unit. You can see it down at the bottom in TVD sub C, and kind of the main takeaway here is that you have gentle structure changing across the unit of a couple of 100 feet. So not a lot of crazy structure happening in this unit.
Sure. Then let's move on to that type log, G3.
Yep, so G3 is a type log. It's also the log that's referred to in the unit agreement in terms of the pool that we want to be unitizing. It includes the tops on the left-hand side, so that unit we're talking about is from about 50 feet above the Upper Bakken Shale down to the Bird Bear, which I believe is consistent with the Haystack Butte pool in the area. In terms of the logs that you see here, I've expanded the log headers to make it a little easier to read on the bottom. There are the digital log curves on the left, including gamma ray, caliper, shallow and deep resistivity, bulk density, and neutron porosity. And then I've also included the raster log curves from the same well, just to have both on here to make it clear in terms of what was being used for the unitization. And this sort of digital log curve stuff that you see here is what will be the same template shown on some of the cross sections later on.
Sure. And let's move on to the cross sections, beginning with the, I guess, the west to east cross section first.
Yeah. Yeah, so the first is a west to east cross section. There's a lot on this page, but so it's not the easiest to see, but when we move to some of the maps, we'll talk in more detail. The main takeaway, which we'll talk about in the maps, is from northeast to southwest, you have some thinning of the Lower Bakken Shale source rock and thickening of the Pronghorn Shale, which we believe is one of the reasons for reduction in the saturation of the Upper Three Forks, and one of the reasons for kind of the western cutoff of our unit.
Okay. And let's move on to the south to north cross section.
Yeah, so the south to north, similar story. We'll talk more in the maps. Again, some reduction in Lower Bakken Shale thickness towards the south, and some thickening of the Pronghorn Shale. I should note that the well on the end of B, the Marinera Trust, is the closest core control that we use to calibrate our petrophysical logs that are used in all these models.
Okay. And let's move on then to the maps, the Isopack maps. You've got G5A and 5B.
Yep, so these first two maps here, the first one on the left is of the Middle Bakken gross thickness. You can see these are 2-foot contours. So across our unit, not a huge change in Bakken thickness, less than 10 feet across most of the unit. On the right-hand side, you have the Lower Bakken Shale. There is some change here as well, from about 16 in the north to 10 in the south. We believe this is one of the reasons for a reduction in water saturation and hence oil in place in the Three Forks as you move towards the west. And in some of the later exhibits, when you see the oil in place, it's also one of the reasons why we have drill spacing units further west as well, but we decided to not we split it out from that other side because we feel this side is better geology than as you start stepping further west effectively.
Okay. Then let's move on to the Isopack for the Pronghorn, G5C and D.
Yep, so for the first one on the left-hand side, we have the Pronghorn Shale gross thickness. This thickening, combined with the thinning of the Lower Bakken Shale, is why we think that saturation in the Three Forks is going down. So Lower Bakken Shale we believe to be the source rock for the Three Forks, and you're having to fill up the Pronghorn Shale before you're able to fill up the Pronghorn Carbonate and Upper Three Forks, which we believe would be the other main reservoir unit in the area. You can see that around, though the contours don't match exactly with the units themselves, generally around the 25-ish foot thickness mark is where we've kind of cut off from the Pronghorn Shale. And our reasoning around that is we believe on the eastern side, you have a better chance of having better wells. And when you listen to Melody speak to some of our development plans later, the possibility of between single layer middle Bakken or multiple layers, while as we move further west, we feel that you have quite a lot less oil in place in the Three Forks, and that you probably or possibly do even less wells per section as well than what we're planning on the eastern side. The map on the right-hand side is the combination of the Pronghorn carbonate and the upper Three Forks, or the Three Forks Bench 1 gross thickness. You can see, similar to the Middle Bakken, the other main reservoir, that there's kind of on the order of about less than 10 feet of change in thickness for that reservoir unit.
Let's move on to G6A and B.
So 6A and B are the oil in place maps for the two main reservoir units that we're accounting for. The Middle Bakken on the left, you can see these are in MMBO per section for 640 acres. And generally there is some change across the unit from east to west, but not a whole lot. But on the Three Forks side, there is a more appreciable change, and this is again one of the subsurface reasons for setting the unit where we're setting it here, where our unit boundaries are based partially on subsurface, but also some of the surface reasons that Brian alluded to and Melody will have to show later on. So even though we have units further west from here, we didn't want to include them as part of this unit because we feel that that geology would be too different.
Sure. Then next one, the combined map.
Yeah, so this is the combined total STOIC map that will be used for those recovery factor calculations and how everyone is attributed how much they own within the unit. I should mention that the tracts, and they were on the previous one as well, the tracts are on here. This is us having digitized some of those tracts that Brian had shown in his previous land exhibit. And you can see from the northeast to the southwest, there is some change. It gets worse as you start moving towards the west, but with the way that we've set up the formula, that should be accounted for in how everyone is given their part of their interest. In terms of what was included for the total STOIP, you'll notice that we've included the upper and the lower Bakken Shale, the Pronghorn Shale, Middle Bakken, the Pronghorn Carbonate, and the upper Three Forks, or the Three Forks Bench 1. Though our models had the Middle Three Forks in as well, on the next exhibit, we'll talk about why we didn't include the Middle Three Forks as part of the total STOIP, because we don't believe at this time that it's contributing significantly or at all to production.
And let's move on then to that map you just referenced, G6D.
Yeah, so in G6D, in the final geologic exhibit, this is a map of our Middle Three Forks, or Three Forks Bench 2, gross water saturation. And you can see across the unit, effectively, you're almost over 70% water saturation. So within a lot of our internal modeling that we've done here and in other areas of the field, once we've gotten about 60 to 65%, we don't believe that you're flowing a whole lot of oil out of the Middle Three Forks. So that's why we didn't include it. However, in terms of the pool, we're still wanting to pool all the way down to the Bird Bear because we don't necessarily want someone to come in and drill underneath us and then frack up into our other reservoirs that we're draining.
Sure. Are you aware of any significant faulting or any other structural anomalies within the proposed unitized area?
Yes, we only have some sparse 2D over the area, but we don't see any significant faulting or structural changes or faulting of the Bakken or anything like that.
I have no further questions at this time for Mr. Johansson. I'd offer the geology exhibits.
The exhibits are admitted. Mr. Forward, do you have any cross?
I have no questions. I have no questions, thank you.
Mr. Bender, I imagine you're still waiting till.
No questions.
And any questions from commission staff?
Yeah, bear with me here. Let's start with a couple of preliminary pieces. Does Burlington have any opposition if the commission were to take administrative notice of any of the geologic information on wells in and around the unit? That would include logs, cores, core analysis, georeports, etc.
No objection.
I'm gonna ask for, digital copies of all the exhibits. Here, so, of the, for the type log and the cross sections, PDFs are fine. For all of the maps, if you could provide, a digital version, something like a shapefile that can be brought into software. We want to be able to do that. So I'm gonna ask for digital copies of all the maps be provided. I'm gonna ask, though, that, you go beyond what was provided in the packet here. I would like the, thickness map, so your isopacks on each formation, that was identified in the type log. The porosity maps for each formation provided. A water saturation map for each formation. And I guess, a B sub O, did you use a flat value there for the whole area, or was there a gradational map of some sort applied?
Yeah, I don't recall exactly for the model, but we'd be able to find that.
Okay,
Yeah. And we do have a map that we've been used as well.
Okay, so I guess like I said, I'm gonna, bear with me, I'm gonna jump
Sure.
around through notes here, but,
Yeah.
so in your oil in place calculations,
Yes.
there was a B sub O goes into that equation. Do you know right now if that was a single value for the whole, or was it something like a gradational?
I want to say for the maps that it was a gradational map.
Okay, so then we'll wanna see
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
map and what those values are across the area.
Sure. I guess one thing I would say for our petrophysical model, so we'd run it basically to the bottom of the second bench. So for the, what we call lower three forks, or the bench 3 or 4, we don't have a good petrophysical model for porosity or saturation in that unit. A lot of it's not something that we focused on because of it having a lot of anhydride in it, and then the saturation already being so high in the middle 3 forks. Knowing that it, in the type log, it goes all the way to the bird bear.
Yeah, so you're specifically stating, the values that you're referencing that you don't have good values for would be for the middle and lower 3 forks?
For the lower 3 forks.
The lower?
So kind of bench 3 or 4, I think some others have used. But we do have values for the second bench, which is what's being shown in the,
As the middle?
yeah, the middle. So middle bit would be our second bench, yes.
Provide, what you have for the middle, and provide what you have for the lower 3 forks.
Okay.
Anything that I've asked for that isn't available, or that you just don't trust, for whatever reasons, provide some kind of, affidavit explaining why that's not there, or why, or what your concerns are with, evaluating that information that you're providing.
Yep. Okay.
So that hits most of my preliminary stuff. So you touched on, in your testimony, you touched on the fact that you were requesting to unitize the entire interval from 50 feet above the top of the Bakken formation to the top of the bird bear.
Correct.
And that's identified in your unitized formation in the unit agreement.
Yep.
And you specifically called out that the oil in place calculations that you've done are only, at least that you provided here, were only done from the upper shale through the Three Forks first bench,
Yes, correct.
okay? And you did those calculations, on both members of the Pronghorn, the upper and the lower members?
Yep.
Okay. And so I've asked that you provide that data to verify that calculation. Do you have the same for the lower part of the Three Forks, or sorry, the lower part of the lodgepole? Was anything done on that?
I think we may have some for, yeah, because we called Carrington and Scallion, some stuff for that. For a lot of it, because the porosity was so low, again, similar story of because it was very low, we weren't including it in the calculation.
Okay. Again, provide
Yeah.
similar as you would for the lower part of the Three Forks. At this point, and I know you touched on that your engineer is going to talk about plans for target of wells. At this point in time, are you looking at a mix of targets between the Middle Bakken and Three Forks, or should I wait to ask these questions for the engineer?
I can answer some now, and we can talk more detail later. So at this point in time, with our internal modeling, it seems to be that placing all the wells in the Middle Bakken is the most effective way to recover out of the unit. Some of the exhibits that we'll show exhibits about other areas where we have more data in terms of pressure gauges, and also some microseismic exhibits as to why we believe that even with the wells put in the Bakken, you are able to drain the Three Forks. However, with a lot of this area too, as we start moving through the unit, we'll be drilling and making sure to test that our models are reflecting the same thing in the production when we're actually drilling.
Okay. That general position that you just indicated, that you feel that there's its potential to essentially drain the reservoir using Middle Bakken targeted wells. How does the thickening of the Pronghorn that you discussed play into that and the effect on that?
Sure. So yeah, like you're probably alluding to for us as well internally, we're thinking the biggest geomechanical difference is probably between the reservoirs in Middle Bakken and the Three Forks, and either the Lower Bakken Shale and Pronghorn Shale. So there is some thickening. However, with the examples that we're going to show, we've also included the general thickness of the Lower Bakken Shale and some where that's present, and then Lower Bakken Shale and Pronghorn where that is present, to show that you do, even with the thickening of the shale or where the shale exists, we have been able to see what we believe to be drainage across that unit into Bakken from Three Forks.
Looking at your type log, it looks like you've digitized the older vintage well that you used as the type log, the logs. You've digitized the logs for that?
Yeah, either we may have or through a vendor obtain digitized logs of that, yes.
Would you be able to or willing to provide an LAS copy of the logs that you did digitize for that?
Yeah, well, whichever ones we had for this one, yeah, we'd be able to do that.
So again, on your type log, exhibit G3 here, in some of the later exhibits, it's identified that that you reference the base of the TF1, and it's E2, it's one of the oil in place calculations, but it specifically references the base of the Three Forks bench 1.
Yeah.
And I just want to confirm, for the purposes of what we're talking about, the base of the Three Forks bench 1 would be equivalent to what you have marked as the top of the middle Three Forks?
Yeah, that middle Three Forks silt TF bench 2 top there would be the base of our bench 1.
Okay. When discussing your exhibit G4, you referenced, G4B, the north to south cross section. You referenced the northernmost well on that, B prime as labeled here. You referenced that was, there was core on that well and core analysis on that well?
Yes, correct.
Okay. And you indicated that you used that to kind of calibrate all your logs, correct?
Yeah, so our petrophys, so that and everything else, we have kind of a larger petrophysical model for the basin. So that was one of the many cores that we used to calibrate all the logs across the basin.
Okay.
But this was the closest one to this area specifically.
Would you be able to, tie in some form of saturation indication? So using your petrophysical model, you've obviously calculated saturations through different formations, right? Would you be able to represent that on a version of the type log in a tract, so we could get a feel for what formations had what percentage of saturations available?
Okay, so you're thinking basically the calculated saturation log is an additional track.
On the type log.
Yeah, we should be able to do that, yeah. And just, yeah, as I was saying, what you'll see, it'll probably run from kind of Carrington Scallion, and then it will stop at the base of the middle Three Forks, so top of the lower Three Forks.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, on your exhibit G1, where you had identified, looks like 5 wells that were used for primary. Let me back up. The data in your geophysical model, was that primarily based on well log control?
Yes.
Okay, do you have seismic in the area at all?
We have a sparse 2D, but it wasn't used for.
Okay, so
yeah.
essentially entirely on well control.
Yes.
Looks like 5 wells were used here on G1. I'm assuming you have wells that go outside the boundary as well?
Yeah, we do. And some of them you'll be able to see to some extent, on exhibit G4A and 4B. You can see they're a little hard to read, but the little red dots are examples of other vertical wells that give us good control through all the way down to the bird bear that were used for our petrophysical model.
Okay. Along with the request for the shape files that you developed, would you be able to provide a spread tabular information, well by well tabular information for the values that were determined at the given wells that you used? And I'm asking for, so each well, each formation, water saturations, porosities, thicknesses.
Yeah, like the average for each formation.
Exactly,
Yeah.
basically the tabular information that you would.
Yeah. Yeah, we'll be able to provide that, again, for everything down to the base of the middle Three Forks. Yes.
Okay. Please do that as a supplemental exhibit also.
And are you looking for the 5 on exhibit A, or basically the visible view in exhibit G4A?
Do the expanded G4A.
Okay.
If it was used in your mapping, I'd like to see the tabular version of that data.
Okay. Yeah, that can be done.
So, getting back to your oil in place map. So your exhibit G6C, typical oil in place calculation. I've already asked for the data that went into that. And I know it's gonna be discussed a little bit further, with the engineer, but, the oil in place calculation that's used in the unit agreement, it was already noted that, the unit agreement has 23%. Can you, and it looks like some of the exhibits used a 23.7 in its calculation. Can you confirm for us, what the 23% is and how it was calculated or how it was determined, or what it, and whether it's supposed to be 23 or 23.7.
Sure. So yeah, I'm not able to determine that 23 versus 23.7, but at a high level, where that 23 is coming from, it's coming from our reservoir model that are based on some of these petrophysical properties. So effectively, that's the estimate of recovery from that model.
So that's the estimated recoverable, the percentage of recoverable oil.
Yeah, yeah, recovery factor of oil for the wells.
And that was determined through your modeling entirely?
Yes, so with our modeling, we provided layer properties based on some of these maps that you've seen. And then that went into the internal modeling that we've done to come up with some of the estimates of how those wells are going to perform, which Melody will talk to some of those performance curves later. And that's, yeah, so that's where, from that model is where that number of 23% is coming from. And it's consistent with, somewhat consistent with what we see in some of our other areas as well. We have different models for different areas of the field and other areas that we operate.
And does that include, does your modeling include some like production history matching and all that?
I believe so, yes. I'm not sure exactly which wells were used for that, but yeah.
Okay. I guess we will want something confirming whether the 23% or the 23.7 that it appears was used is correct. I mean, we need that verified.
Yeah.
On your oil in place calculation, water saturation for the various formations, how did you calculate water saturation?
So for the, I guess I'll start with, for the shales, the Upper Bakken Shale, Lower Bakken Shale, and Pronghorn Shale, those were using basically some core points that we had, and we don't have a lot of good core points for those specific formations, but we were using the porosity and permeability and saturation from those core points, applying that as an average across the unit, and then using the thickness changes for those three. The reason for that is our petrophysical model, which is an Archie water saturation equation model for the rest of the formations. We didn't have a good way to take away the very high organic carbon component which exists in the source rocks in the Pronghorn Shale. So for the Middle Bakken and Upper Three Forks and some of these other formations down to the base of the Middle Three Forks, it's an Archie water saturation equation that we used. And then for porosity, where it's kind of bulk density, was the bulk density derived porosity that we were using.
Okay.
Yeah.
Would you be able to provide another supplemental that would break down that calculation for water saturation? Include what was used for AM and N values in Archie's, and again, per formation. Include, I know you just gave some verbal testimony on how you did it through for the shale portions, but please include how you determined water saturations for the shale intervals as well.
Okay. Yeah.
I think that's all I've got for now. Thank you.
Are there any further questions from commission staff? We'll move on to your next witness. Ms. Jing, please raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear or affirm, under the penalties of perjury, that the testimony you're about to give in this matter will be true and correct to the best of your knowledge and belief?
I do.
Melody, can I have you state your name and give us your business address?
Sure. My name is Melody Zhang, and the business address is 935 North Eldridge Parkway, Houston, Texas 77079.
And Melody, by whom are you employed?
ConocoPhillips.
Okay, and what's your position with ConocoPhillips?
Reservoir engineer.
And Melody, have you previously testified before this commission?
I have not.
Why don't we go ahead and have you take us through your educational background and work experience?
Sure. So I have a Bachelor's of Science in Petroleum Engineering from the University of Texas at Austin. Graduated in 2019 and have been employed with ConocoPhillips since as a reservoir engineer for the Bakken.
And Melody, are you familiar with the proposed unit?
I am.
And were you involved in preparation of the petition for unitization?
Yes, I was.
Okay, I'd move the testimony of Ms. Zhang be received as that of an expert in this case.
The testimony will be received as that of an expert.
And Melody, let's start with Exhibit E1. Can you walk us through and summarize that exhibit for us?
Sure. So Exhibit E1 showcases a table of the 19 existing wells that are in the proposed unit outline. So we have 19 horizontal wells, 17 of which are operated by Burlington and 2 of which are operated by Continental Resources. So for each well, we have included the API number, the unit location, and then how much each well has produced by July 1st, 2021 in million barrels of oil, 1,000 barrels of oil, sorry. The expected EUR for each well in oil, the remaining reserves for each well as of July 1st, 2021, and the 90-day current rate of each well by July 1st, 2021.
Okay, and Melody, let's move on to Exhibit E2. And with respect to E2, we've got an E2A and an E2, and just for explanation, the E2 is what was pre-filed, and there, we noticed we had a Scrivener's error in that, and in E2 it's highlighted where the change is made. So Melody, if you want to just go through E2A, which is the corrected exhibit, and take us through that and address the production allocation formula.
Sure. So we have 2 allocation formulas here modeled after previous units and previous NDIC guidance. So the first allocation formula is calculated to compensate owners for hydrocarbons which would have been produced from each tract had the unit not been approved. And phase 1 will begin on the effective date of the unit, and it will continue until the cumulative production from all wells reaches 8.6 million barrels of oil. And in the previous unit, the existing wells oil EUR is adding up to that 8.6 million that we're referencing in this exhibit. So for the allocated production to each tract, that formula includes that it will be the total unit production multiplied by the following: 10% attributed to the well contribution acres, 45% contributed to the well's current rate, and 45% contributed to the well's remaining reserves. And so we did this because we wanted it to be half and half between current and future. Phase 2 allocation formula will begin again when the 8.6 million barrels of oil is reached, and that is calculated to compensate owners for hydrocarbons that will be produced as a result of the unit operations and development, and that is based on remaining recoverable oil in place of each tract. So we'll have for each tract the total unit production multiplied by the tract recoverable oil in place divided by the total unit recoverable oil in place. And that oil in place calculation, as Shira described, is including from the Upper Bakken Shale to the base of the Three Forks Bench 1.
Okay, and let's move on to Exhibit E3 with respect to Phase 1, the breakdown of the allocation by tract. Can you take us through that exhibit?
Sure. So these 2 pages, we have calculated for each tract what the allocation percentage would be for Phase 1. So we'll have the tract area of each tract, its associated fraction percentage, existing well's current rate, and its associated fraction percentage, the existing well's remaining reserves, and its associated fraction percentage, and then the total calculated allocation percentage for each tract.
Okay. And then, Melanie, moving on to Phase 2, Exhibit 4. Again, here we have a 4A and a 4, And the purpose of the 4A is to reflect some minor corrections to some of the data in what you've got identified as your INGA spacing unit, which is tracks 1A through 1D. So if using 4A, and then the second page is just the existing Exhibit 4, so.
Sure, so this table, again, similar to the last table, is for each track calculating the allocation percentages for the Phase 2 formula. So we have here existing wells EUR, the tracked original oil in place, the tracked recoverable original oil in place, and the remaining recoverable oil in place, and its associated allocation percentage. So as noted, the 23.7% is used in this allocation table, and I know we have the 23% in the formulas, so I will clarify offline exactly which one is the correct one to use, and we will submit that after the hearing.
Then let's go ahead and move on to Exhibit E5. Can you just kind of walk us through what your proposed development plan is going to look like for this unit?
Sure. So in the yellow outline is the proposed unit outline. We have here in the orange block premised pad locations, and then in the orange and black crosshatch, the premised facility locations. As discussed in Brian's section, we believe that unitization will help us minimize minimize our surface footprint, and we can consolidate by having centralized facilities. And so we have here, based on our modeling, that the Middle Bakken only was the most effective way to develop the unit. So here we have shown 76 in-unit wells in the black dotted lines, and this is based on 660 foot between well spacing on a Middle Bakken only basis. So that's approximately 8 wells per DSU. And then we have 4 unit line wells that are shown on this plot. You will note that the top right northeast corner and then the middle on the right, we did not include the unit line wells there. The top of which we have discussions with another operator that they would like to develop the unit line there. And in the middle, because of neighboring in well bores along that unit line. For the economics, we used a 78 well count, and that is the 76 in-unit wells, and then 2 net wells for the 4 unit line wells.
Okay. And Melody, before we move on, would this development plan that you've got proposed, in your opinion, with the allocation formulas that you've previously discussed, is that going to protect the correlative rights of the owners within this proposed unit?
Yes.
Okay. Then let's move on then and kind of to elaborate a little bit on what Shira has discussed. Can you take us through the Exhibit 6A and kind of touch on what you're looking for with respect to the Middle Bakken development?
Sure. So as discussed, the model suggested that Middle Bakken only wells were the right way to develop the unit. So the next 2 exhibit just show some evidence and some data on why we believe that that's the case. So 6A is showing some information, pressure information to validate this. So the top left corner will show a graph. In the red is the Haystack Butte proposed unit. And in green, we have the Three Rivers pilot, which is also shown in the plot in the top of the page. So the red dot is showing the Uber walk-in vertical monitor well. And then we have 3 blue wells, which are 3 Middle Bakken wells that were drilled, completed, and put on production while the Uber walk-in was monitoring these wells. So those 3 wells are the Frio, Brazos, and Llano, and the information for that is also shown in the table below. The green and the orange wells in that plot, Middle Three Forks and Upper Three Forks wells, were developed after these Middle Bakken wells, so they were not co-developed. The pressure graph in the middle of the page shows pressure on the y-axis and time on the x-axis. And what this is showing is while these Middle Bakken wells were fracking, the pressure gauges in the Uber Bakken well that were in the Middle Bakken and in the Upper Three Forks were showing pressure tracking alongside each other during the frac event and then also later on during production. In the top right of the page, we're showing the total shale thickness for the Uber Bakken well, which is around 25 feet. And then for our 2 control points in the Haystack Butte unit, which are 32 and 36 feet. So the shale thickness in the Uber walk-in is slightly thinner than in the Haystack Butte unit.
Okay. Let's move on then to E6B.
E6B is showing microseismic for multiple information that we have. So we can see in the top right corner the locations of these 3 DSUs. Again, Haystack Butte in the red, and then we have Bulrush in the purple, 3 Rivers in the green, and Golden Creek in the yellow. So for the 3 Rivers, which is in the green, as well as the Golden Creek in the yellow, these monitor wells were monitoring the Middle Bakken wells before the Upper Three Forks was developed, so they were not co-developed with the Three Forks. And you can see through the microseismic that we're seeing events growing into the Three Forks as well as the Middle Bakken. And then the last one, the Bulrush, these were co-developed. These Middle Bakken wells were co-developed with the Three Forks. And again, you can see that there are microseismic events in the Three Forks as well. And then the well name and total shale thickness on the right of the page. We're showing the thickness for the 3 Rivers, Golden Creek, and the Bulrush. So you'll note that the Bulrush thickness is 36 feet, which is pretty similar to the Hogan one in the Haystack Butte unit.
Okay. Let's move on to E7 then. Sort of ties into what both Brian and Shear have already testified to, but can you, using the topo map, kind of describe and explain why you're looking to develop the proposed unit?
Sure. So this is the same development plan that was shown on the previous exhibit, and we've just overlaid the topographical map on top of this. And so this is really to show that the surface topography is quite challenged in this area, and so we think that unitization will really help us place pads and facilities at optimal locations and be able to minimize our surface footprint as well.
Sure. Then let's move on to exhibit number E8. Can you take us through that and explain the impact of the federal interest within the proposed unit?
Sure. So I think mentioned by Brian that this area is a federal unit. So we have lots of federal minerals as well as U.S. Forest Service along most of the unit as well. And so we really took this into consideration when planning for the development plan for the unit. As we know, we'll need to have longer timelines for permitting pad locations as well as our corridors. And so in the red line, you can see where the premise pipelines are. Most of those, or a lot of those, will cross through the U.S. Forest Service land. And so we wanted to make sure that we're coordinating with them and getting our environmental assessment done and just planning for that timeline with this unit.
And then let's move on to E9. Can you just describe for us what development might be like without unitization?
Sure. So we did look at if this area were not to be unitized, what development could look like. So in the best case scenario, we would be able to develop the same number of wells, though there would be larger setbacks and therefore shorter lateral lengths for some of these wells. And in a worst case scenario, if we were not able to develop off-unit pads, then we would not be able to develop those the wells in red, and so our well count would dramatically decrease in that scenario.
Okay. So then, Melody, in your opinion, is the unitized management calculated to substantially increase the ultimate recovery of oil and gas?
Yes.
Okay. And would that also prevent waste?
Yes.
Let's move on to Exhibit 10. And again, here we've got a 10 and a 10A, and the 10A kind of reflects the corrections that are highlighted where it differs from the pre-filed 10.
So Exhibit 10 is showing for each DSU the existing wells in those DSUs and what their EUR is. And then we have in the green, the yellow, and the red, the unitized scenario, the non-unitized scenario, and the non-unitized scenario in which we would not be able to develop off DSU pads. And so for each, we have the number of remaining wells total EUR, as well as remaining wells EUR per well. So between the yellow and the green scenario, the well count is the same. As you can note, it's 78 wells. However, the remaining EUR is slightly lower due to the increased setbacks that I discussed in the previous page. And then in the non-unitized off unit scenario, in the red, you can see the well count is dramatically decreased from 78 to 30 wells. And the associated remaining wells total EUR is lower as well.
Okay. And then, let's move on to Exhibit 11, and again, we've got 11A where we've highlighted where we've got the corrected data. Take us through that comparison.
Sure. So the top table is showing unit versus non-unit scenario. So that is the green and the yellow shown in the previous exhibits. So for each, you can see the total capital spent, rate of return, NPV 13, EUR, and well count. So again, the well count is the same. However, the EUR is slightly lower in the non-unitized scenario due to those setbacks. And in addition, would be slightly higher capital costs in a non-unit scenario with slightly higher completion costs as well as facilities costs. And then in the second table below, this is the red scenario versus the green scenario. And you can see the associated benefit of having the unit for in NPV 13, well count, and an EUR associated. And at the bottom of this exhibit, I've just included some of the assumptions that were used in these economics.
Okay. And with that in mind, Melody, in your opinion, would the value of the additional oil and gas recovered exceed any additional costs that might be associated with conducting unit operations?
Yes.
And would the creation and development of the proposed unit, as you've described, would that be for the common good of all the owners within the unit?
Yes.
And will the unit result in the general advantage of the owners of the oil and gas rights within the common source of supply?
Yes.
I have no further questions at this time, and I would offer the engineering exhibits.
The exhibits are admitted. Is there any cross-examination from Mr. Forward?
No, thank you.
No questions.
And questions from commission staff?
Melody, again, bear with me. Notes all over the place here, but, I guess starting with, your phase 2 allocation. The tracks as identified in your phase 2 allocation, and then in looking at your tables, E3 and E4, specifically so E4 in this case, when the oil in place was calculated, determined via the model, was that done first at the spacing unit? And when I'm saying that, so by 1280, and then the oil in place was attributed back to the individual subtracts based on what you have in the track number table?
So I did not personally run the reservoir model. That was run by a different reservoir engineer, so I would have to go back and check. But I know that when I put these allocation tables together, I did have a spreadsheet that had each like water saturation, et cetera, by tract.
So you had individual
By section.
values, so by section, or by spacing unit, or by tract?
By section.
Okay,
And then I was able to change that into by tract.
okay, so it sounds like the calculation then for like an oil in place was done at each individual section, and the values provided, and then that those calculated values, your oil in place in that case, was calculated for a given section, and then if a tract happened to be in that section, it was subdivided based on its acres?
That's correct.
Okay. And is that the same then for the way the EOR was done?
The EUR.
So, and I'm talking phase one, then the calculation, estimated ultimate recoveries. Well, that's also in phase two, I guess.
Oh. So the existing wells EUR, we would have had, I would have had, forecast each existing well, and then taken those forecasts in, and for this, for phase two, it would be attributed per track. So for example, the Inga DSU has 4 tracks, and we know that there are 3 Inga wells, so those would have been, based on the tract area, et cetera, would have been attributed to each tract from there.
So would you have done your forecast for each well? So to simplify it, let's talk about a single well spacing unit as it exists today.
Sure.
So you would have forecast that well,
Yes.
and you would have applied that estimated ultimate recovery for the spacing unit for that well, which would be 2 sections, because they're all
Yes.
1280s,
Yes.
okay? And then you would have taken and subdivided that forecast or that projection to the individual tracks by acre.
Yes.
Okay. So what it appears, when I looked at it, I just wanted to clarify that that's how it was calculated and done. When you, so looking at E5, and I just want to confirm, I think it's pretty clear in the testimony, but just confirm, at this point in time, Burlington is looking to develop this, the rest of the spacing units, or the rest of this, to develop this unit, the rest of the wells in the unit, as Middle Bakken target wells only,
Correct. That's the premise development at this time.
okay? If you were to adjust that and choose to drill some Three Forks wells, would those Three Forks wells be entirely Three Forks Bench 1 wells?
Yes. At this time, if we were to decide to drill the Three Forks, we would do Three Forks Bench 1.
Looking at your E6B, when you were discussing this exhibit, you indicated basically that the stimulations in the Middle Bakken are effectively able to, you see responses in the Three Forks. That's what this exhibit is showing us, correct?
Correct.
Okay. Do you believe those responses that you're seeing are propped I mean, they're fractures, right? They're indications of fractures. Are they propped open fractures?
I believe so.
Okay.
And I guess I would add too again, neither of us are microseismic expert, but yeah, propped open with water. I wouldn't say that microseismic can tell you where sand is going necessarily, but this is suggesting to us that, yeah, we are at least.
So initiated fractures, at least at those depths. Connectivity directly to the wellbore is somewhat questionable.
That would be more based on the pressure response that Melody showed in the previous one, and then also, yeah, in areas where we have Bakken and Three Forks wells, interference between those wells when one is shut off or the other one is open, so to speak.
Do you have evidence of productive interference very near to this unit area, where you can provide indications of you have Bakken wells that are communicating to the Three Forks First Bench?
Where we have, yeah, Bakken and Three Forks wells next to each other, we do see that in most of our field, so we can probably provide some examples of that.
Could you provide a supplemental that would
Yeah.
kind of lay out what you're seeing as Middle Bakken, Three Forks communication? Whatever your closest example of that is to the unit area.
And we know that there is a unit just to the north, not operated by us, operated by Continental, that does have Middle Bakken and Three Forks, and we are partners in that unit.
Yeah, whatever, as long as you can provide the information that shows that communication, that it continues to communicate. Going back to the E6B, all of the examples shown here are essentially east of the unit area, right? There's one that's several miles north and it's just a little bit to the east, but everything is east, correct? So I guess the pronghorn that was displayed in the cross-section, the east-to-west cross-section, is thickening to the west, right? Thinning to the east. I know you've provided some pronghorn, so lower Bakken shale and pronghorn shale thickness values on this, but how comparable are these stimulations to the westernmost wells that'll be drilled in this unit, where you do have a significantly thick pronghorn that comes into play?
So I would just note here that Three Rivers, Golden Creek, and Bulrush, these were 2012, 2013, and 2015. So we know that coming in and when we develop these wells, we'll have a more modern completion to these that could make up for some of that thickness potentially.
Okay, so you still expect that you'll be able to stimulate through that thickness and reach whatever reserves are in the upper Three Forks?
Yes, and as we move west, we would be able to test and continue to change our development plans if we needed to at the time.
Okay, and that would be a scenario where if you determine that you weren't seeing what you expected out of the Middle Bakken wells, you might target a first bench Three Forks well.
Correct.
Okay. Might have a little bit more in a minute, but that's it for now. Thanks.
Thank you.
Melody, I have some questions on a few of these. Exhibit E1, the cumulative oil that you're calculating as of July 1st of 2021 does not include the first day of July, right?
I think what I noted down that I did include the first week of July. The first last date is July 1st, 2021. So it would have included July 1st, 2021.
Okay, typically, I don't see that. I mean, when it says as of July 1st, it means basically 7 a.m. of July 1st, so it would be production all the way through June 30th, including that production. But when I went to verify the numbers, it appeared to me that you may have used the January 2023 cum and then subtracted out July through December production to get that number, because every one of your cums are higher than what I calculated on this. And this doesn't, of course, give an exact number, so I couldn't find out exactly what it was because it's in thousands of barrels. But it appears that that is incorrect. I would want you to submit the January 1st, 2022 cum on each of these wells, and don't just give per thousand. I would want the total barrels of oil, and then address the issue that I spoke of. Does the July 1st, 2021 cum oil include any July oil?
Okay.
And I do stress the fact that typically it doesn't.
Okay.
in any of these units that I've done on these.
Sure.
Under the next column, the EUR, how did you arrive at the estimated ultimate recovery, basically the remaining primary? What are your decline parameters that you used?
So I would have gone in and forecasted each of these wells on a single segment decline, and then gotten the EUR from there.
Okay,
And then the second
that
part of
doesn't
your
give me
question.
much detail, but
Sorry.
what did you use historically to forecast your decline? Did it vary from well to well, or did you specifically use a date from here to here?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
Well, you forecasted production based upon current or historical production in the well, right?
Correct.
And you did it on a well-by-well basis.
Correct.
So to forecast future production, what did you use for historical so the program would draw the future remaining primary?
I would have just matched the most recent segment that made the most sense in terms of how the shape of the tail.
Okay, so you kind of eyeballed it then and used whatever you thought looked best?
Yeah, I don't have specific numbers.
Okay.
Yeah.
And did you forecast using all the production that you had on the well, or was it only through June of 2021? Because there were 5-6 months of additional production that you had on the well. Did you utilize all of that production?
Sure. So we must have had for some of these wells, there's a slight data lag, and so I would have forecasted these wells around the same time that I pulled the cumulative oil. So I can't recall off the top of my head right now if there was 3 months or 5 months that I've neglected, but I must have used everything that I had to make the best shape for each well.
And what program did you use?
OFM.
And so it's picking between a hyperbolic and an exponential decline, is that right?
Correct. Most of these wells have been online for quite some time, so that's why I just use the single segment of decline at the end.
And when you say single segment of decline, you mean you forced them all to go exponential?
I believe so. So usually when I forecast a new well, when it first comes online, I'll use a 2-segment decline. But as most of these wells have been online for quite some time and have started to flatten out, that's when I would have used the 1-segment decline.
Okay, and again, when you're talking 1 segment versus 2 segment, you're saying you would decline it hyperbolically down to a certain exponential decline, and then that would be your second segment on exponential,
That's
right? So what did you use for your exponential decline? What
I
percent?
don't have the number off the top of my head.
Okay. Did you actually calculate these, or did your department?
I forecasted each well. I just don't
Okay.
remember the decline number for each well.
I would like for you to submit the actual curve of each one. You would have the curve and then your projection on it,
Yes.
and then also what parameters you used, what it was declined out to. And if it was a 2-segment, a hyperbolic, and then exponential, I would want you to, be certain to note that.
Okay.
On the last column on Exhibit E1, I talked briefly about this with Brian, and this is the online barrels of oil per day, right?
Correct.
So on the well that I talked about that had production days but no oil production, did you use that in the calculation?
I don't recall which well that is, but I would have asked, I would have done the current rate for online 90 days, so above 0 barrels of oil for each of those days, each of the
Okay.
90 days.
And of course, the commission doesn't have daily production, so I can't verify any of the numbers. So if you would go back and list the daily production for each well, so it would have to be each one of the 90 days that you used, I would want that for each well.
Okay.
So you would have the production for each well it was on up to that 90 days, so I can verify that. Then on Exhibit E4A, we mentioned before, and we've talked it a couple times now about the 23.7%. You said that you're gonna have to clarify what you used. Is it 23% or is it 23.7?
So
Well,
I did use 23.7%
I
in
realize
the
that.
allocation
But
tables.
what I was going to say is that you cannot use 23%, 23.7% if the unit agreement says 23%. You have to use what's in there. So if you want 23.7%, that's gonna have to be amended.
Understood.
So please verify that and submit that information to us. On the Phase 2 allocation table, that's E4. All of these numbers will have to be changed, so if you find any errors in any of the tabulation for the Phase 1 or Phase 2, you know, you'll have to amend those exhibits, and certainly E4 will have to be changed if you're using 23%.
Yes.
On Exhibit E5, it appears to me that there's only 2 Three Forks wells that have been drilled within the proposed unit area, is that right?
That's correct.
Okay. Okay, that's all I've got, thank you.
Thank you.
I do have a couple other items real quick. I guess for either geology or engineering, are either of you guys able to identify or indicate if you're aware of any Three Forks Bench 2 or middle or lower Three Forks targets in or around the unit? Are you aware of any at this point?
Yeah, not within the unit itself, none. In this general near area, not a lot. So my guess, I wouldn't know exactly right now, but I would assume more towards, either towards the west as you get onto the narrower portion of the Nesson Anticline, or to the northwest as you get onto the more, the crestal portion of the Nesson Anticline.
Okay, so nothing in the immediate area.
Yeah, nothing in the immediate area that I know of.
The E6B, the microseismic exhibit, pretty small, and I'm looking see if we can quantify anything on this a little bit. Would you be able to provide something like a count of the events in the targeted formation and in the offsetting formation, based on the information from these microseismic maps?
Yes, I'd have to try and, again, not being an expert on how these are more kind of, the visualizations out of the program, but I could see if it's something that we can try and tease out from some of these projects. Some of them are, you can tell, a few years back, so, but we can dig to see what we can try and find.
Right. So if it's possible, if you could provide something like that, that it just kind of gives us a way to tabularly, instead of just purely visually, evaluate it.
Yeah.
Along with that, I noticed the top two have intensity indicators. If you can include that in the counts, that they're scaled by the magnitude of the event. I don't know if the same would be available for the lower, but if possible.
Yeah, no, I'll look to see if I'm able to find the background details on some of this. For some of these images, they're, pulled from summary PowerPoints of some of the microseismic work that have been done in the past.
Okay. If for some reason it's not available, just address that in the supplemental.
Okay, yeah, but yeah, I'll look.
And I guess, lastly, two pieces here. Again, it's been indicated the proposal is to unitize the entire interval. At this point in time, you're not indicating any intent to target anything in the middle or lower Three Forks. But we're also not evaluating based on what's been provided so far and in the oil in place calculation and in the formula as proposed, you're not including an oil in place value for the middle or lower Three Forks at this point.
No, not in the calculations, no.
With it being included in the unit, if you were to target anything in the middle or lower Three Forks, do you feel the formula allocation would be protective of correlative rights when we haven't evaluated any oil in place values in those intervals?
I guess we've looked at kind of what the oil in place would look like in the middle Three Forks, so it's, which is lower, but I guess I believe that most of the oil in place exists in the units that we've talked about, so that would be my just personal opinion of that it's covering most of, most of that oil. That's where most of the oil would come from, even if you had some oil in the middle Three Forks with the higher water saturations, you again may not be able to pull it as well if you're just due to the permeability, but then also the relative permeability of the higher water saturation observed in that formation. So yeah, I guess because of believing that most of the oil is in the upper portion, that's why we're thinking it's still protecting everyone. We do have a mapped oil in place for the middle Three Forks. We don't for the lower Three Forks, but I'd assume it would be even lower if there's interest to see what that oil in place looks like too.
Yeah, I've already asked that the
Yeah.
middle Three Forks be included in the
Yeah.
supplemental exhibits. Whatever you can provide for the lower Three Forks,
Sure.
please do. What you are aware of at this point, would the oil in place that you have been able to calculate in the middle Three Forks and whatever you've been able to tease out of the lower Three Forks, would they be similar patterns as to what you've presented in your other oil in place, your total oil in place maps, or?
Sure. Yeah, I think the pattern would be, and I guess my example, and it's kind of jumping back exhibits, but on the last geologic exhibit, as you were seeing, the saturation was water saturation generally increasing for that middle Three Forks too. So like the other maps, there's a general trend of somewhat higher oil in place in the northeast versus the southwest, and then to a point where we cut off the rest of the west, making the unit the size that it is. So that trend follows through some of the other formations as well.
Okay.
We believe the reasoning for that, again, being the thinning of the source in the lower Bakken Shale and the thickening of that Pronghorn.
Okay. I'm not sure what form this would take, but would Burlington be opposed to a requirement that if you were to desire to come back and target in the middle or lower Three Forks, that we would have to come back and evaluate, I guess, the formula for the unit at that time?
I guess I don't know if I can speak to that, but
Similarly, it was addressed earlier about the potential for injection into the unit.
Yeah.
The unit agreement allows it. And again, I don't know what form this would take in an order, but would there be opposition to a requirement that if you were going to proceed with injection, that you would have to come forth through another hearing with the commission to evaluate?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, we would be fine with, if we intended in the future to do any type of injection operation, that we would come back to the commission to seek permission to do that type of I guess, enhance recovery.
Okay, and so similarly, if you, at this point in time, you don't intend to target the lower Three Forks, but if you choose to go down that road, would that be also something you'd consider reasonable?
Yeah, Mr. Suggs, I think to the extent that, that there's additional targets where we haven't, evaluated and don't have intentions of developing at this time, we would agree to come back to the commission prior to drilling any shares. Is that okay? Like, before we would potentially evaluate or develop any middle or lower Three Forks, we would agree to come back.
Okay. I think that's all I got. Thank you.
I do have one other question for Melody. When I was talking about projecting remaining primary on these wells, I didn't ask you about the economic limit. Did you calculate that for each well using lease operating costs, or did you assume like a 4 barrels a day per well?
So
For
I,
each well.
I do have economic limit rate and date for each well, for the existing wells. And that would, we would have had a 1 barrel per day cutoff, but the economic limit rate could have been higher for each individual well.
Okay, so it defaulted at 1 barrel a day, but you use lease operating costs to determine what that was. Is that right?
I'd have to double check about the lease operating costs, but I do have economic limit rates that I could submit if necessary.
Okay, well, I would want you to verify what you use for economic limit, and if it wasn't consistent with each well, then I need some type of justification on why you used what you did.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
Any further questions from commission staff? Seeing none, Mr. Mann, do you have anything further in your case in chief?
Nothing further, Mr. Examiner. Thank you.
All right, we'll move on to Mr. Forward. Do you have anything?
I have nothing other than to request that the record be kept open for a short period of time as we anticipate submitting a supplement to the letter that Liberty Corporation submitted earlier. Thank you.
Okay, Mr. Bender?
Mr. Examiner, I guess in terms of submitting additional exhibits and leaving the record open, I'm not interested in delaying this one bit, but if, when those exhibits are submitted by Mr. Mann, if we could receive copies and perhaps have a day or 2 business days to respond, I would appreciate that. Like I said, we may be able to respond quicker. In addition to that, since there are going to be additional documents submitted and additional information, I would request that the examiner require Burlington to also submit a new unit operating agreement that will include the language that they agreed to today with respect to audits on 3.28. And then finally, with respect to Liberty's request that section 11.8 existing non-consent interests be eliminated, I think the commission has to look carefully at the language that's in 11.8 before it makes a decision to go forward with Mr. Forward and Liberty's request. That clause provides for an opportunity for working interest owners and operators who drilled wells prior to this unit being formed to recoup their interests from non-consenting owners. In addition to that, it also allows the recoupment of a risk penalty. And in my view, eliminating that provision, as BR testified, may cause some administrative expenses. I'm not going to respond to that, but I think it could cause some serious problems and some correlative rights issues with respect to working interest owners who drilled wells, carried non-consent interests, and then this paragraph is removed, and now they can't even recoup the interest that they paid for, much less the non-consent interest. So, and beyond that, it just doesn't make sense to sort of reset the clock here and then go into a unit situation where the statutes and the provisions of the unit operating agreement under section 11.6 allow for a risk penalty. And one more comment on that, if the commission, and I don't think they should, but if the commission were to decide to eliminate 11.8, I think you need to look at other provisions in Article 11, because there's other provisions that deal with respect to the non-consent interest, the reversion of the non-consent interests under 11.12. So it's not as simple as just eliminating 11.8. There are all sorts of ramifications to correlative rights if that provision is eliminated.
Mr. Hearing Examiner, may I just respond to that?
Yeah.
All due respect to my colleague, but that's a bit of a straw man argument, because that is not, we're not advocating for complete removal of section 11.8. If the commission reviews the letter that was submitted by my client, you'll see that we're advocating for a modification that would provide only revenue attributable to each non-consent well and a tract be used to pay off the existing non-consent penalties. And that is all we're asking for. 11.8 should stay in the proposed agreement, but which is the modification. Thank you.
And if I misspoke, I didn't have an opportunity to read the letter, so.
Yeah, Mr. Examiner, with respect to the updated unit operating agreement, that's fine. You know, we intended to provide an amended operating agreement reflecting those changes, and we'll do so. And Mr. Bender, with respect to the exhibits, you want copies of all of the technical, what are you talking about? Like, you want to be copied on the supplemental exhibits? You're talking about everything?
I mean, if you're gonna forward them to the commission, as I expect you are, in electronic form, if you can just copy them, that'd be great.
Sure. And then,
Because, excuse me, because I mean, I don't know what some of these adjustments are going to do to Continental's interest and to XTO's interest that Mr. Hicks was quizzing your engineering witness about. That could have an impact on their percentage of ownership, so I think they should have an opportunity to take a look at that.
and, well, yeah, and it'll be filed anyway, so I don't anticipate any issues with that. And then, Mr. Examiner, with respect to, obviously, the record's gonna be kept open for, you know, a lot of the supplemental information, but to the extent that Mr. Ford or his client were indicating that they want it left open to file something additional, I think that's inappropriate. I mean, they've already had the opportunity to appear, they submitted their letter, we know what their position is. I don't think we really need any more supplemental information on 11.8. Every party has made their position clear on that, and I think it's inappropriate. I mean, everybody's had a chance to address that, so I think that issue's closed.
Any comment, Mr. Ford?
Other than, I don't understand what the concern would be. It would just be probably a 1 or 2 page letter and quite honestly, the commission knows the issue and is in a better position to weigh whether or not the supplement should be regarded or not regarded. And I think that's well within the commission's discretion to consider an additional supplement just on that discrete issue. We're not talking about a lot of paper.
And Continental and XTO don't take any position on that, other than we'd like an opportunity to respond, once again, 2 business days.
All right, well, any comment from commission staff on that? Yes. I don't see any reason that we can't allow the record to remain open for Mr. Ford to respond, and then if a response is necessary, leave a few additional days to respond.
I think you want to make sure that you do allow the folks to respond to it.
Yeah. So, would 2 days be an adequate amount of time to respond to something like that, or? I guess.
Mr. Examiner, maybe, but I mean, without knowing what's gonna be filed or when it's gonna be filed, I mean, if I've got other, you know, hearings or something like that and don't have any opportunity, I mean, 2 days may definitely not be sufficient. It just depends what it is and when it is.
Sure. So, let's provide, well, why don't, let's start with the time you're gonna need for your supplements.
Yeah, that, there's quite a bit there. I mean, is that, I mean, up to 30 days or less than that?
Yeah. Yeah, maybe up to, ideally more, just because there was quite a few items, so up to 30 days or.
30 days?
30 days. That would live at the 31st. Why don't we leave, so 30 days for any initial supplements, then why don't we leave the record open an additional week thereafter for any response? Would that work? So,
So 7 days. Is that what you're thinking, or?
yes, so. Oh, I have April cut off here. It's Friday. So let's do April 8th. Would that work for everybody?
Yes, Mr. Examiner, thank you.
So to be certain, Burlington will submit all of their supplements on April Fool's Day, right? That's what we're looking at.
Something pretty.
April 1st, I'll say. And then 7 additional days to respond. Okay.
Is there anything further from any of the parties?
When do you get?
No, Mr. Examiner.
I can get my, I can get my supplement in within 7 days from today,
Okay,
Mr. Hearing Examiner, if that's okay.
I would appreciate that.
And I have no position on how long Burlington can have to respond to that.
Mr. Bender?
Wait, do you have a
Uh,
suggestion?
7 days to
7 days?
respond.
That works for me, too.
Leave the record open for 7 days. For that initial response, so that will be March 8th. That's a Tuesday. And then 7 days for a response, that will be March 15th.
One additional request to add a supplemental from the Burlington side. If you can provide the Phase 1 and Phase 2 allocation tables when you do, correct whatever numbers, provide them also digitally in a spreadsheet or something.
Sure.
Thank you.
Is there anything further?
No, Mr. Examiner, thank you.
As a point of order, I think I only called the first case in this one is, I imagine 29225 is also part of this argument.
Yeah, that's correct, Mr. Examiner. The one case is to address the ratifications, which we will be filing.
So, is there any objection to me calling that case and then just incorporating this hearing?
No
into that one?
objection.
So, with that,
Wade, are you wanting us to take, to leave it indefinitely continued until we receive the ratifications? Or are you wanting us to continue it to a subsequent date?
I think if we could just have it be an indefinite extension until we get the ratifications filed. I don't anticipate it'll be long, but I don't have a date certain. And in the event something came up that we didn't anticipate, just prefer indefinite if that works for the commission.
The ratifications that you are requiring or that you're using, does it say that they are ratifying the unit as approved by the commission?
Do you have a copy,
I do.
Brian?
Well, I think I do.
I can't remember the exact language, Mr. Hicks.
There's one of them.
Yeah, as approved by the commission.
So if there are any adjustments or requirements by the commission, it would be automatically ratified? Okay.
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
Very well. And that will conclude the hearing in case number 29224. And I'm just going to call the next case here. Case number 29225, in the matter of the petition of Burlington Resources Oil and Gas Company, LP, for an order of the commission determining that the unit agreement and unit operating agreement constituting the plan of unitization for the Haystack Butte Buck and Pool unit, McKenzie County, North Dakota, has been signed, ratified, or approved by leases and royalty owners owning the required percentage of working interest and royalty interest within said unit. The hearing from the case number 29224 is incorporated into 29225, and the record will remain open indefinitely.
Thank you, Mr. Examiner.
Thank you.
Concludes our hearing.